Chapter 6. The determination and the anger was building inside Benson again, and Ryan knew it. They were both up against a strange, almost invisible block wall, trying to break through a maze of half-truths and bureaucratic jumble. Both detectives' instincts told them that something was terribly wrong. For Ryan, it was a professional sense of pride that drove him, but for Benson, it was something else. The man was black, and it made a difference. Kenyatta stood behind a small bar in his apartment and refilled Edgar's and Rufus's glasses with Jack Daniels. It was the second fifth of whiskey used already. The night was still young, only about 10 o'clock. The men, 4 others besides Rufus and Edgar, had been gathered inside the well-furnished living room for 3 hours. In the bedroom, Betty and 2 nurses, plus the doctor, sat and attended to Elliot Stone. He had been sleeping since being taken out of the hospital. The anesthesia had not yet worn off, and the doctor had been giving him a series of cortisone shots to minimize the pain when the wounded man did come to. "There you go, my man," Kenyatta said, after pouring the shot into Rufus's glass. "Go easy. It's gonna be a long f***ing night."
"Yeah,"
Rufus said, taking a slow sip of the whiskey.
"We don't know, do we?"
Kenyatta looked at his friend determinedly, almost coldly. "Just a matter of time, my man. When Elliot comes to, then we'll know." The 4 men sitting along the couch and on the chairs listened to Kenyatta closely. They were all black men, all dressed in business suits, and all well-trained Kenyatta men. Almost all of the men had shaved heads, and none wore mustaches or long sideburns. There was Duke Sims from the Valley, Amos Courtner from West Los Angeles, Little Mike Allen from East Los Angeles, and finally Stonewall Manfred from Compton. Each man representing over 500 Kenyatta recruits had been called into the meeting by the man himself. None of them had been aware of Elliot Stone and his operation at the OEO office. Kenyatta had managed his growing organization with the idea that no one section knew the operation of another. That way, in the case of a massive raid, he will be able to control the leakage of information and ensure the survival of other sectors. Kenyatta had learned well from the failures of the Black Panthers in the East. He had studied their operation and had learned where they had made their mistakes. Basically, they had been too well organized for their own good, and the government, seeking to destroy their threatening existence, had been able to strike quick and hard at the leaders, thus dismantling the entire operation with a swift, powerful stroke. Kenyatta would not allow the same thing to happen to his people. Stonewall Manfred leaned forward and stared down at the glass of Jack Daniels he held in his hands. "Listen, Kenyatta," he began in a baritone voice. "We gotta find out who hit the f***ing OEO before we make our move." Kenyatta listened as Manfred spoke at length about the possibilities of an all-out gang war in the ghettos, a war that would destroy every organized section of blacks in the city. Finally, Stonewall finished and sat back. "You're right, Stonewall," Kenyatta said. "But once we do know where it's coming from, we got to get it ourselves. We got to move in there and blow the whole f***ing operation." Amos Courtner, considered by all to be the coolest head in the group, listened intently to Kenyatta's words. The man had seen Kenyatta this way before, while emotionalism and rage took over, leaving the man's reasoning powers suppressed by the mighty forces of his hatred and anger. He decided to speak up now, knowing that Kenyatta was still in the throes of his own anger.
Listen, Kenyatta,
Courtner began.
we all dig where you're coming from. We know it. And we all feel the same about those bastards. But we got to keep something else in mind, too.
Kenyatta put his drink down on the bar and leaned forward. He admired Courtner and respected his opinion. Okay, Amos, I'm listening.
Well, like Stonewall said, we don't want to start no fucking gang war. Not because we couldn't wipe their motherfucking asses, but because it wouldn't do us any good. When Stone wakes up and lays it on us, we'll be in a position to do one of two things. We could blow the fuckers off the face of the earth, or we can go inside their organization, find out if it's a street operation, or if there's heavier shit going down, then make our decision.
Courtner waited anxiously for Kenyatta's reply. Kenyatta glanced around the room. The black faces were watching him intently, waiting for him to give his reply. Finally, the bald-headed leader spoke. Okay, I can dig where you're at, Courtner. We'll wait till we hear from Stone. No action till then. Courtner breathed a sigh of relief. Secretly, he had been fearing Kenyatta's temper. The man would just as soon take to the streets and start murdering any man he thought might have had anything to do with the hit at the OEO offices. That, Courtner knew, would have been suicide, and in more ways than one. Since Kenyatta's arrival on the West Coast, the organization had been built slowly and painstakingly. Barely a handful of men knew of Kenyatta's existence, and most of those men were sitting in the room at that very moment. The element of secrecy was maintained as a safeguard and also as a means of securing the most information possible. Every man sitting in that room believed firmly that a huge organization existed outside Watts that supplied the junkies, the high school kids, and the young black girls of that ghetto with heroin. Each man had witnessed, in his own way, the breakdown of life around him as more and more of the white powder flowed into their communities. And each man had made a commitment to someday get to the root of the operation and destroy it. That goal could not be put into jeopardy by hitting some small-time junkie somewhere who they thought was responsible for 2 deaths and Stone's injury. The decision to wait had been made. The men settled themselves down for a long night. Betty made sandwiches and passed them around. The 4 section leaders played poker. Kenyatta and his 2 closest men, Rufus and Edgar, stood around the bar drinking Jack Daniels and talking softly among themselves. At 10:30 that same evening, young Joe Collins was walking along 53rd Street toward Compton Avenue. The small, young black man carried a suitcase and a jacket draped across one shoulder. His movements were purposeful, and he walked quickly because he was heading back toward Kenyatta's apartment. That evening, after Elliot Stone had been secured in the bedroom with the doctor and nurses, Kenyatta had told Collins that he wanted the young man to stay with him in his apartment. "We can't risk having you on the streets," Kenyatta had said, warning Collins not only about the police, but also about the same people who had hit Stone's office. Collins had insisted on going back to his mother's small house alone and telling her himself that he would not see her for a couple of days, maybe weeks, and possibly even months. Hurriedly, Collins had run home. His mother, now into her 60s, sat in the living room, watching the television set that Collins had bought for her the previous Christmas. She was an old woman. Her body was shriveled, and little hope or joy remained in her dark, sagging eyes. Only when she saw her one surviving son did she express a glint, a glimmer of happiness. Joe Collins had once had 2 older brothers, but both men had been called up by the Army after the Tet Offensive in the late 60s. They were both killed within a week of each other in frontline action. Collins had read the reports and had heard the rumors saying that black men were virtual guinea pigs in the jungle war. Collins had believed what he had read. Now he stood in front of his mother, a woman who had lost 2 sons already, and tried to explain to her why he was leaving. Her eyes were sometimes cold, sometimes blank, as her youngest son stammered through his explanation. The old neat house was dark except for the light of the television, but Collins could see the hurt he was causing inside the old woman.
I'm sorry, Mom,
He said softly.
but it's something I got to do. I'll be back. Don't worry about that.
The old woman nodded. She reached out and took her son's hand and squeezed it. Joe knew at that moment that she understood. "Thank you," he whispered into her ear. The woman nodded again, then took his other hand and placed it on hers. She held him like that for a moment longer, then let him go. Joe stood up and went into his bedroom and began packing a suitcase. He could hear the inane canned laughter of a television comedy show, then listened as the show broke for a commercial. 2 black people, a man and a woman, were glowing idiotically over the merits of a soap detergent. Joe listened for a moment longer and knew that what he was doing was right. The young black crossed Compton Boulevard near the lines of bars and nightclubs. They were fairly quiet on this Sunday evening, and only a few ravaged-looking hookers stood on the sidewalk outside. Turning the corner and walking down Manchester, Joe Collins found himself on a dark part of the street. He began walking faster. It was at this point he realized that there was a car behind him, pacing him step for step and about 60 feet away. The young black man's heart began pumping. He heard again in his mind the warning from Kenyatta. But then he reasoned possibly it was Kenyatta himself. No, he thought. Kenyatta would have stopped and picked him up. Collins realized at this moment that he was a sitting duck for whoever was in that car. There was nothing to do but try to escape. A small, dark alley stood about 50 feet ahead of him. Without missing a beat, the young orderly broke into a frantic run toward the alley. The blood was rushing through his brain, and only vaguely did he hear the car accelerate behind him. His feet slipped on the pavement as he tried to make the right turn into the alleyway without losing a step. Trash cans tumbled about him. He got to his feet again and could see the reflection of the car's headlights on the opposite wall. The alley was nothing more than a loading driveway for the warehouse at the far end. There, a loading dock stood, its platform 6 feet off the ground. Behind that was a corrugated metal door. There was no exit from the dark cavern. All the passages were sealed by brick walls and the loading dock itself. Collins scrambled frantically toward the dock. He knew he was trapped, but the act itself of attempting to escape was the only thing holding it together. His heart beating wildly, he jumped onto the small ledge and in front of the metal door. The car turned into the alley and moved slowly toward where Collins stood. He was blinded by the headlights and could not see how many men were inside. The car stopped 10 feet in front of the dock. Collins was backed up against a metal door. He could feel the ridges digging into his back as he pushed himself with all his strength against the corrugated metal. He prayed that he could somehow melt through that door and regain his life inside the warehouse behind it. Doors opened on either side of the car, and Collins could hear the movement of men as they got out. He thought he detected the quick, almost imperceptible glint of metal.
Man,
Collins shouted into the blinding headlights.
I ain't done nothing. Please.
There was silence from the other side of the lights, the only noise being the purring of the engine. The young black peered through the glare of lights. In his last moment, he was being blinded, unable to see even his own death. 2 explosions rang out in the alleyway, one from either side of the car. The first blast hit Joe Collins in the face, ripping away his nose and right eye. His brain matter was plastered against the metal door behind him. Later that night, the coroner would find his right ear 30 feet away, lying like a piece of garbage in the small alley. The second blast, within a millisecond of the first, hit him in the stomach. The shells penetrated his flesh from one side to another, tearing his guts out of the safe confines of his body. By the time the 2 shots had been fired, there was more of the black youth on the metal door than there was on the landing. In his last moment on Earth, Joe Collins had seen 2 bright flashes as the guns had been fired. He had imagined that he was standing in the jungles of Southeast Asia and that his 2 brothers had once been walking where the 2 landmines had exploded. Their bodies had disappeared instantly, and with them, Joe Collins had entered the eternal blackness. At precisely the same moment Joe Collins was destroyed by assassins' bullets, Elliot Stone regained consciousness. The wounded man opened his eyes and saw the small room, the face of the doctor, and the pretty face of Janie, one of Betty's nurses. For a split second, Stone felt a twinge of panic surge through his brain. He knew he wasn't in the hospital, but other than that, he had no idea what was happening to him. Through the cloud of his growing awareness, he heard the doctor yell the name, Kenyatta. Relief flooded through Stone instantly as he realized he was under the care of the only man he could trust. When Kenyatta entered the room, he found Elliot Stone smiling.
Hey, my man,
Kenyatta said happily.
Kenyatta,
Stone whispered.
I can't believe this shit, man. What the fuck is happening?
Kenyatta grinned and rested his hand on Stone's shoulder. Man, we got you out of that fucking hospital. Couldn't let you hang around there, my man. No fucking way.
How?
Stone asked. We had a man inside, a kid named Joe Collins. He'll be here soon. A good fucking man, that kid. Stone felt himself lighten immediately. It was good to hear Kenyatta speak of his men, especially with the kind of pride and care he used when they had done something well. Obviously, this kid Collins had done well.
What about the others? In the house?
Stone asked after a brief silence. Kenyatta shook his head. Man, those fuckers did it in. Ain't no way Jimmy or Frank could have made it through.
Shh,
Stone said. The night was coming back to him as he talked with Kenyatta. The nightmare standing there, knowing the men who held the shotguns were going to pull the trigger. The flash, then the pain, then the fire. He remembered his fantasy of driving through the Notre Dame line and into the end zone and chuckled. What's so damn funny, Elliot? Kenyatta asked, grateful to see Stone laughing.
Just thinking about what we went through my head when I was getting out the fucking house. Man, I thought I was playing football again. The Notre Dame game.
Kenyatta laughed. My man, You did about as well as you did in that game. No shit. The two black men reminisced about the game for a few minutes. Kenyatta had not been there, but Stone had been able to obtain the films. At a party earlier that spring, Stone had proudly shown Kenyatta and a number of friends his moment of glory captured on film. The ex-football player was not conceited. The way he explained it was by saying that very few men have a moment like that in their lifetimes, and he was simply damn proud of his. It was really as simple as that with Stone. He knew the CEO and their motherfucking system would try to take everything away from him and his people. But that moment on a Saturday afternoon was something that no one would ever be able to take. Finally, the conversation turned to the previous night. Kenyatta had asked Stone what he had been carrying in the film when they were hit. It took a moment before Stone could reconstruct everything in his mind. The film, he remembered that, and the phone call, and then the discussion with Frank and Jimmy. Yes, they had made a link, had discovered something in the operations of the dope ring in Watts. Stone thought hard, and suddenly the picture returned, and the pieces fell into place.
Okay,
Stone said softly.
I've got the shit together.
Okay, Elliot, lay it on me, my man. Kenyatta leaned forward and listened intently. Stone took a deep breath and began speaking.
We know about this dude, Wilbur Seamus,
Stone began, his voice now without emotion.
What we didn't know was where his junk was coming from. First off, we knew he had connections downtown with the cops. His street corner pushers would get busted and be out within like a couple of hours, you dig?
Had to be in narcotics working right with him, Kenyatta mused.
Yeah, exactly,
Stone replied.
Well, we had Seamus and we knew about his street people, but then we stumbled onto what appeared to be a contact. A white dude, a man I would recognize, would come by Wilbur's place over 55th Street.
Yeah, Kenyatta added. The Paris Club.
Right. The two dudes will meet like every third Tuesday of the month. The white motherfucker carrying a briefcase. We had pictures. Shh.
Stone stopped for a moment, realizing for the first time what the fire had done. It's okay, man. No way we could change what's happened.
Yeah,
Stone said, still upset.
Shh, those fucking photos would have sealed it.
There was a silence for a moment. Both men stared at the floor, and then finally, Stone returned to his subject.
Those pictures, Kenyatta, showed the dude what he was bringing and when. We had it all, especially that white motherfucker who has to be the main contact outside the city, or at least lead to the big man.
Kenyatta remained silent. He had heard of Wilbur Seamus, but had thought nothing more of him than a street corner hustler. Within a week, Stone had unraveled a complex organization that had involved Seamus, a white pusher, and a network of street pushers. There was no doubt that Seamus was the man they were hitting Watts. We're going to hit Seamus, Elliot, Kenyatta stated coldly. Stone looked at his man, then frowned.
No, man,
he began.
We got bigger fish to fry than that We got to find out who that whitey is. You dig where I'm coming from, man? I mean, all of us know ain't just is out there on the streets peddling that shit. We know there's some pretty powerful white motherfuckers behind that whole thing, and now we got ourselves a chance to nail them.
Kenyatta listened to Stone. Basically, he was saying the same thing that Cortner had said earlier that evening.
Listen, my man,
Stone said, resting his hand on Kenyatta's arm.
We'll get the bastards in the head. We can't shoot our wad till then. Aight, bro? No way.
Kenyatta knew that Stone was right. He nodded. Okay, man, we'll infiltrate. I got a line of some stuff from Algiers. I'll set up delivery. Stone smiled. At least now, after all his efforts, there will still be some kind of payoff.
You're going in the dope business, man? I never thought I'd see the fucking day.
Kenyatta laughed along with Stone. Deep down inside, though, both men knew just how serious the situation was. The doctor came into the room and told Kenyatta that Stone needed rest and to leave the room. The two men shook hands and agreed to talk again in the morning. Kenyatta watched as the doctor gave Stone his injection of cortisone. See you tomorrow, brother, Kenyatta said as he left the room.
Yeah, tomorrow, man,
Stone said sleepily. When Kenyatta entered the living room, he noticed Rufus standing next to the bar. The man's face was tight and his mouth formed a grimace. What's happening, my man? Kenyatta asked. Rufus looked at the other men in the room before speaking.
Joe Collins, Kenyatta.
Joe? What about Joe?
He was hit tonight, about 2 blocks from here.
Kenyatta looked at the men in the room. His first impulse was to pull his arms out of the closet, get his men together, and hit Wilbur Seamus. But he remembered what he had discussed with Stone, and he knew, deep inside, that a mere hit wouldn't pay for all the damage that had been done. They would have to break open the entire organization, and the only way to do that was to get inside. Kenyatta immediately began laying plans to get a pound of uncut heroin into the country. With that amount of white powder and his virtual lack of identity, Kenyatta figured that he would be able to crack any organization, no matter how large. At that moment, on that windy Saturday night in South Central Los Angeles, no man could have imagined just how large and powerful an organization they were going to infiltrate. Had they probably would have satisfied themselves with the murder of Wilbur Seamus.